Jay Flores was raised in Chicago alongside his twin brother, and they were just 8 years old when his father took them to the border for the first time to smuggle their very first load of drugs. By the time they were in their 20s, the twins had built an empire. They were distributing drugs from the cartel into 15 different American cities, as well as Canada. Jay says they were making $3 to $4 million in profit every single month. In this conversation, Jay is taking us inside of the cartel. He'll describe coming face-to-face with El Chapo to negotiate trying to get his brother back after his brother had been kidnapped. And he talks about the most dangerous decision he says he ever made, to betray El Chapo and help the U.S. take him down. You'll notice he is obscuring his face for his own safety here. Here's our conversation. Jay Flores, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I understand you brought your first load of drugs across the border at just 8 years old. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, what I could remember, my father was in prison till I was around 7.5 years old. Him coming home, I guess he didn't like the poverty we were living in, and he couldn't take that. And it wasn't long before we made our first trip to Mexico, and we became like basically his helpers, his apprentice. Coming across the border the first time, my father had forgot our birth certificates, and as soon as they asked for our documents at the border that we were crossing, it was the Laredo border. The Customs and Border Patrol said, can I see everyone's documents? And he didn't have our birth certificate. Automatically, they sent us for a second inspection. And I recall my father like turning around telling my brother and I, whatever you guys do, don't say anything. We had helped them pack the marijuana in the gas tanks by then. And, me and my brother have this way of communicating where we don't use many words. It's like, it's a twin thing where we looked at each other. And to us, I still remember thinking, come on, like, really? You don't have to tell us that. They end up separating us from my parents, me and my brother, and they started just basically asking us questions about, where we lived, what school that we attend. They just wanted to make sure that we're not being, trafficked across and we were with the right people. And at that time we were twins, right? We're identical twins. So at that period of time, we're a big deal still. People still looked at us and we're like, amazed that we look so much alike and they would dress us alike. And yeah, so maybe 5-6 questions, and after that was just friendly, typical twin questions, like if I hit you, would your brother feel it? Stuff like that.
They weren't asking you, did you help your dad pack drugs in the gas tank?
Yeah, exactly. They weren't, and I think at that time it was a taboo still, believe it or not, for someone to consider that they were using a family to cross drugs across the border. That was still not a thing yet. It was probably the beginning. I know that things have changed. Who people are capable of anything right now. But at that time, I think that they were still not considering that someone would use their family as basically as a way of deflection, or or to be help get drugs across the border. So that was our first trip. The first trip right around the age of 8. And it was, one of many, dozens of trips across that border as a child.
Yeah, I understand you brought 100 loads of drugs across the border by the time you were 13. What was it like to basically apprentice your father? And I'm sure through the eyes of a child, perhaps it almost felt like a game. It felt like, just business as usual. I would love to hear more about that.
That's a great question. Me and my brother hated that life.
Even from the beginning?
Even from the beginning, because we're caste society, growing up in the neighborhood. Like, I think that even though we grew up in a little village, in the southwest side of Chicago, at that time, it's working class neighborhood. Most parents, they understood who our family was, and they understood what we did, and they basically didn't allow a lot of kids to hang out with us. We were looked at as the bad family, right? And to us, it was like a job. It was not something we liked. Me and my brother, I remember as kids, we used to tell each other all the time, like, I hate that I was born into this family.
Wow.
Those are our words to each other. And early on. But I will say is that as we continued on, it was something that we had to do. When we had to travel to Mexico, we had to like help my father basically, bring down gas tanks and fill them up with drugs. And then when we got back to Chicago, it was our job to basically, take the drugs out. And then we had to pack them up into, 1 pound bundles, to us, it was work. No one was ever allowed to come to our house. And it was like a job that we disliked.
Your father was finally arrested when you were 13, and then he fled to Mexico. Is that right?
Yes, man. He was arrested for the second time. He posted bail and went on the run, and he took me and my brother with him. And, we started our life in Mexico. By that time, it was like a second home to us.
Oh, I didn't understand that. He fled to Mexico with you and your twin brother.
Yes.
What did he tell you about this period of time?
My father just lived life for what it was. He was not going to be sorry about it. To him, it was like, let's go. You guys are our sons, and I have to watch over you. And too bad that you can't, continue your life in Chicago. He was just someone who really didn't have a lot of empathy, especially the way he grew up. And once we were in Mexico, of course, we missed home. We were born and raised in Chicago. We missed everything about being back home. And at that time, my older brother had he was a high-ranking member of the Lion King street gang in Chicago, and he was also a drug trafficker.
Explain to me, this is the moment that your older brother comes into the picture, and this is not just about marijuana anymore. He deals in cocaine. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. So my older brother, by then, he had became, I guess the neighborhood, kingpin at that time, and his drug was cocaine. He felt bad for us, and he said, "Hey, you guys miss being home," and I was like, "Absolutely." He said, "You guys want to come back?" And I said, "Yes, sir. Like, of course, And he said, "Look, I'll make sure that I'll talk to my parents and bring you back home as long as you follow the rules." And which was, make sure you have to go to school, come in before curfew time, and stay out the corner. Like, he didn't want us to get shot. At that time it was, violent, and he basically said, and stay out the way.
He didn't say that a condition of coming home is that you needed to help with the drug trade.
It's the last thing he ever wanted from us.
Hmm.
He told us all the time, like, that we were not going to do that. Everything was a life lesson. But the environment we were in is that he was a really big drug trafficker, and we lived with him. He actually built a basement for us. He built a 2-bedroom apartment for
And this
me
is
and my
in
brother.
Chicago?
In Chicago, yes. And we're 13 years old, and basically he would give us $50 a day and said, "That's for you to eat, just in case you guys need anything." He'd provide for us, and basically you guys are on your own. So at 13, we're on our own.
Are you still going to school at this time?
Yes, absolutely. That's one thing that was very important to him. We're going to Catholic school. And
Jay, you're
yeah.
going to Catholic school during the day, and you're coming home and packaging cocaine.
Yes, I think that, what, it just kind of like, it's not something he even considered, but he started just basically, asking for help, or, go do this or go do that. And, from small things to bigger things. And next thing you know, we're actually, helping him, bag up cocaine and sometimes cook cocaine at our house. And again, being preached and being told all the time, this is not what you're not going to do this. And I will say, those years, to us, it wasn't even a thought. It's like what I knew was almost like natural. And I never even considered that was going to be my life.
Yeah. And you ended up becoming one of the biggest drug distributors for the Sinaloa cartel. I understand you and your twin brother just dominated a large part of the United States. By the time you're 19 or 20 years old, how much profit, how much money are you making?
Yeah, I didn't think that was ever going to be a thing, but me and my brother started, and we took over the business on, my older brother, they didn't want this for me. He didn't hand me the business. We had to kind of create it, but we knew everything there was to know. And at 17, we started off, on our own. Our first deal was for 30 kilos of cocaine. And by the time we were 19, we were selling upwards of, 800, 900 kilos a month of cocaine. And later on, we ended up distributing in 15 major United States cities in the United States and Canada.
Wow.
So there was a time, before I even turned, by the time I turned 20 years old, we were profiting anywhere from, $2 million to $3 million a month. You know, and to us, it was almost like normal. It's not like we sat it around like Donald Duck and, we went and jumped in money or did anything like that. We were not like, we didn't celebrate the money we had. I think to us, being part of the life, we knew that as easy as it came, that easy it could be taken away, especially with law enforcement. Even while I say that, it came with a lot of suffering by then as well. People, I know, we don't talk about a lot, is that my family suffered through every type of, suffering you could suffer from drug trafficking. I have an older brother named Hector who died of a heroin overdose when I was 13. And, to my father, to the family, it was like they didn't blame the drugs. They blamed him for using the drugs. And, we mourned them, for a week, and it was back to business a week later, as if like nothing happened. And, by then we had been through home invasions. They tied up my mom, probably 3-4 months into when I started drug trafficking. My mom and a 3-year-old nephew.
Who did this? Who was behind the home invasion?
We never found out who it was, but it was, there were armed men that came in the house and ended up tying up my twin brother, my mother, my sister-in-law, and a 3-year-old nephew. And we had been through so many stuff already by then that it was like we did live in fear, but it was almost like a thing that we had to do. And 19, 20 years old, we have, we're making $3-4 million a month profit. And it was something that I never thought that I was gonna get bigger than that. It wasn't something I was planning. It was not like a master plan of that I was gonna dominate the drug trade in the United States. It was just something that just happened.
Yeah. And how would all of this work? How did you end up working so closely with the Sinaloa cartel and a lot of, huge names in the Sinaloa cartel, the drug lords, in charge of the whole thing? Would you physically go down to Mexico, receive the drugs from the Sinaloa cartel, bring it back up across the border, and then distribute it? Or what does that end up looking like?
The only thing that me and my brother did was we picked up the drug trade. It was already there. All we did was organize it, basically. The drug trade was there. Our first deal of drugs that was 30 kilos were there already. And there's hundreds of thousands more, that were actually being shipped to Chicago at that time already. And we were just basically the middleman. And for a lot of times, it's like, when I think back about what made me and my brother successful, I have to say that it was those morals and principles that they had nothing to do with the drug trade. Stuff that I learned from, my father, from, my upbringing in Mexico, is that respect, have respect for everyone, treat everyone with respect and kindness, and never steal, and being responsible by keeping your word. So those things allowed us to have friendships and with different members of the Sinaloa cartel, distributors, that we had no idea who they represented, who they worked for. At that time, we really didn't, ask questions, and we really didn't care. We were distributors in Chicago, and as long as they brought us the drugs and if for a good price, we would sell them. But right around 2000, I started actually meeting more people, and I started going to Mexico to basically negotiate large shipments of drugs. But I would just negotiate them, and it was their job to actually bring them up to Chicago and basically give them to me, and then I would basically sell them to wholesale customers. And
did you work directly with El Chapo or El Mayo?
Yeah, that came a little bit later. But by the time I met El Chapo El Mayo and Arturo Beltran, at my initial meeting, I was already selling 2,000 kilos of cocaine a month in Chicago and nearby cities like Milwaukee, Detroit, St. Louis. And it came because, they kidnapped my twin brother.
Kidnapped your twin brother?
Yes, for a debt that was owed, a $10 million debt. And I had, you know, basically made enough friendships and always came through for every one of my suppliers that, I started calling in favors. And when the ransom call came, they basically said, hey, we work for Chapo Guzman, and Chapo Guzman kidnapped, your brother, and you need to come up with $10 million for a debt that was owed.
I mean, what is going through your mind in that moment? I mean, is there a real possibility that you're never going to see your brother again?
Absolutely. Besides me hearing that it was Chapo and me understanding being in the drug trade, understanding what that means, it was his second time being kidnapped at that time.
Wow.
The first time he had been kidnapped by law enforcement in Chicago. It was basically a corrupt Chicago police squad, and kidnapped her, and they had kidnapped them for 3-4 days, and I ended up having to pay a $2.7 million ransom to rescue him. So at that time, I felt like I was already kind of like I already knew what to do.
Jay, you're saying a corrupt Chicago police officer, Chicago law enforcement, took your brother and demanded a more than $2 million ransom from you to get him back?
Yes, ma'am.
And has any of this come to light? Is that officer still working? Tell me more about this.
Just to give you some background, so that officer was working with a paid informant for the Chicago police officer named Saul Rodriguez, and he was, I guess, working both sides. He actually almost made $1 million as an informant working for Chicago police, and eventually, I guess, he flipped his handler, and together they kidnapped many people, including my brother. I think they kidnapped over 43 people, and that case was part of like the first case out of Chicago that we actually cooperated on that led to indictment in Chicago, and it's a pretty famous case. The informant received 40 years. The police officer received a 19-year sentence, and I think he did 7 years total before he was released for COVID.
Wow. So this was a corrupt Chicago police officer working in tandem with a confidential informant.
Yes.
Wow.
For many people don't, believe that corruption exists, in the United States. They always think it's like something that only happens in Mexico, but yeah, it's common.
When your brother was kidnapped by the Sinaloa cartel, was he taken from the United States or was he in Mexico?
No, by that time we were on the run ourselves from an indictment out of Wisconsin, and he was actually taken by corrupt Mexican law enforcement.
Where?
In the state of Zacatecas.
Okay, so in Mexico.
Yeah, in Mexico. And he was kidnapped, and he was held for 23 days. And in between him, being held captive, I was able to make some phone calls and basically negotiate a meeting, with a face-to-face meeting with Chapo Guzman. And
tell me what that meeting was like.
At that time, Natasha, I will say that we idolize these people. Like, to us, it was like, people would say, be careful what you wish for. It was like a dream at one time to say, oh, I'm gonna meet, and be able to negotiate or do business with one of the biggest drug lords in the world. Yet here I was in unpleasant circumstances, and it was frightening. I remember before, actually, once I secured the meeting and a caravan of sicarios came for me, I said my goodbyes to everyone, and I feel like that was going to kind of lead up to the change, but it was all these almost close calls of life and death that we had to actually endure, that was going to basically start building, I guess the strength and the determination for me to be able to walk away from that life. But certainly this was one of them, and I said goodbyes, because I didn't know what was going to happen, and got on a Cessna and flew out to the Sierra Mountains in Sinaloa, Durango mountain range, and met the biggest drug lord in the world. And yeah, I was in fear of my life for sure. And but I think my determination to save my brother I think that was overcoming the fear. And I basically, um, you know, my interaction with him wasn't pleasant. The first 10, 15 minutes, I will say.
You are meeting El Chapo for the first time in person. What was he like?
Meeting him for the first time, it's that picture that you see on most TV shows. Is he was surrounded by maybe 120, 130 sicarios with, anywhere they have rocket launchers and grenade launchers and radios, and they're all in military, right, fatigues. Oh, it was hard for me. I had to endure all that fear, and now I'm standing in front of the biggest, drug lords in the world, who's a violent man. And at first glance, I don't think he appreciated that I was there. He basically told me, like, what do you want? In Spanish, like, what are you doing here? And I told him, I said, look, I'm Jay Flores, and I've been working for you, for the last 6 years, 5 years, and you have my brother kidnapped, my twin brother kidnapped. And he said, he basically told me, like, you're very brave to come up here, because he said, you're wasting my time, and he said I would kill you and go about my day.
He said that.
Chapo told me that, and I basically said, sir, like, I think this would change everything. I said, sir, you know what? I do understand that, and I know that, and trust me, if I didn't feel like I had the right information for you, I wouldn't be wasting your time. I wouldn't be here. And I said, the only thing that I have is my word, and I thought that that in the business we were in, that mattered. And when I said that to him, he kind of looked at me and said, like, okay, like, then what? And I said, well, I started basically just talking, and telling him that for the last, 5, 6 years that me and my brother had been moving, the majority of his drugs, and, I had my ledgers with me in the school bag. And, I went to pull them out, and he said, don't, he kind of brushed me off. He said, don't waste your time. He said, anyone could write something in a notepad. At that time I did feel like, my heart sank, like, I'm in the mountains, and I basically just started saying, well, I said, well, I have references, I've been dealing with this person were big lieutenants, and I guarantee you that they would, speak up for me. And when I started mentioning some names, he basically said, oh, you know so-and-so? I said, yes, sir, a good friend of mine. And that kind of started convincing him, where he basically said, kind of eased up. And I remember him telling me, like, you look too young, like, how old are you? And I think, at that time, I think I was just 21 at the time. I was 21 turning 22. And I said, yes, sir. I started at a young age. And then the conversation basically came to my upbringing. He wanted to know, who my father, and he knew people that actually knew my father, and, where Tana was from. And basically, like, he just wanted to know about me, and what our family did for a living. And I remember he said that he asked me, he said, so what does your family do in the state you're from, Zacatecas? What did he do for a living? And I said, sell drugs. And he laughed. He laughed, and we kind of laughed it off, because that's what we did, right? It's not like we're known for something else. And I think that kind of like broke the ice. And that first meeting lasted 5-6 hours. There was times where it was, I didn't think I was gonna, like, ever leave.
Didn't think you would ever leave, like you thought he was going to kill you?
At that time, I really thought that there was a possibility that I was not gonna make it out alive. Okay.
But did that 5 or 6 hour conversation lead to you getting your brother back?
I always say that not only did it lead to me getting my brother back, but I left, before I left, he was already offering me a large shipment of cocaine. And I think that this basically solidified what was to come. I remember he basically told me, I have like 500 kilos of cocaine there if you want them. And I remember looking at him, I said, sir, with all due respect, I said, I'm not here to make business deals. I'm here to get my brother back.
And what did he
He
say?
he said, I like that. I respect that. He said, go get me my $10 million, and I'll make sure you get your brother back.
So he still demanded the 10
He
million.
said, man, that hurt me. That hurt me because I didn't question it. I said, yes, sir. And I remember he must have seen that I didn't like what he said, and he told me, he said, look, you know, you're in the business. He said, money comes and goes, but you can never get your brother back.
Hmm.
And,
Did you have the 10 million on hand to be able to do that?
you know, at that time, the business doesn't always work like that, where we could be making the money, but it was going back into the business, right?
Right.
And it's not, you know, sometimes it's a waiting game.
Now, where did you get the 10 million?
You know, whatever I didn't have, I had to put up, and you know, I over kind of paid at that time with properties and, you know, jewelry, and they basically had like someone come appraise the jewelry, and I put up you know, properties I had, and they brought a notary, I remember at the time, to make sure that we signed off on you know, those properties. You know, I always say that, just, you know, to make it clear, that for every drug that's seized, doesn't matter the quantity, for every drug that's stolen, someone, some way pays for it. And the same goes that you could pay for it with money, you could pay for it with properties, cars, jewelry maybe, or you could pay for it with your life.
Hmm.
And if it's not it's not your life, it's going to be one of your family members.
What did you say to your brother when you finally saw him again?
Yeah, it was a roller coaster ride from the time I, you know, first sat down with Chapo to the time I got my brother back. I think it was, you know, I want to say maybe 2 weeks later after that. And my brother had been, you know, tortured, and yeah, and you know, I remember, like, you know, I have a twin brother. It's a little different, where I remember, you know, seeing him for the first time, and I remember thinking, now I know how I would look if I was dead,
Wow.
because he looked that bad.
What did they do to him?
You know, I try to like keep that a little bit private, and I rather let him say that story. I don't think that's for me to say, but
It was bad.
it was bad. You know, he was traumatized. I do believe it changed him. Going through these hardships, it changed him. You know, how captive he lost like maybe 40 pounds. He was sick. He still actually suffers from those kidney problems too. You know, just being limited water and stuff like that. So yeah, it was one of those things that I feel like my brother went through it, and then like I went through it with him.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of got, you know, these things that happen in our life. I think it not has to do just with drug trafficking. I'm talking about in general. It kind of shapes us and molds us, right? And these are going to
Sure.
be the things that are going to like really change our personalities, change who we are. And me being nervous, like I learned how to basically conquer those fears, you know, like going to accept that you might not come back, you know, alive. Kind of just gave me the courage, or maybe just to be able to face my fears, and just like even to this day, you know, with what I'm doing today and working with law enforcement, where people are like, you know, what are you doing here? Like, aren't you fearful? And you know, to me, it's, you know, I learned to basically like overcome them, and it's kind of molded me to who I am today, and molded my brother to who he is, you know, in a different way.
That's a really interesting perspective. And, you know, I want to talk about that journey to you deciding to stop this life and to turn yourself in, which is an extraordinary moment and an extraordinary thing. But, you know, ironically, it wasn't that moment where you got your twin brother back after he was kidnapped, because you were even more sort of entrenched and enmeshed, and the relationship had only grown between you and these, you know, different Sinaloa leaders. You describe, you call it being addicted to the money as well, which I find interesting. I wonder, what was your relationship like, knowing your role in just the destruction and the death of so many Americans? I mean, did that weigh on you at all? Did you think about it at all?
You know what? I think it's that the term called cognitive dissonance, right? And we bring it up all the time. Is that to me, it wasn't, I was raised with the belief that everyone has a choice. I never actually maybe considered that I was actually the one doing the damage. Again, maybe because I felt that drug trafficking was already there and it already existed, and it took me basically some time. And it actually took, me actually being with my wife and her actually just pointing things out that I really didn't consider. Because when you're in a world of negativity, or you're in that criminal world, the more negative you do, the more you're celebrated. In a way, you have this environment, you live in this bubble where that's the only thing you think about. And I know it's hard for people to kind of understand, but I never really considered those things. I never considered, what I actually was doing. Because there's for most of the time, my brother and I didn't see the drugs. We didn't touch the drugs physically. But I will say that it's also an addiction. The addiction of money, the addiction of the business, of the power, and that what comes with it. And I know that it's a common, thing that you see in the movies, right? How it's glorified. I would say that my brother and I could have been a little bit different, because we never resorted to violence either. That's my, and I hope that I'm able to use my life as a deterrence, because, my brother and I were basically living every criminal's, right, dream. Every drug trafficker's dream, that, being, to come up from the bottom and go up and become, this powerful drug lord, and have, the amounts of money that you could never dream of. And we lived that life. But yet we never changed who we were, I would say. We didn't, give in to the pressures of what that, the criminal world actually pushes on you, which is that you have to be a certain way, you have to be violent, that you have to listen to what people talk about you. A common trait for me and my brother, is that a lot of people, in the criminal world will call us that we were soft, right? Soft, seeing that we're like, we didn't fit the profile. And today I preach that, well, if you're not soft, which I hope, then you're not going to make it to where, my brother and I made it. Because one thing that the cartels actually look at, it's, if you're violent, they're going to treat you with violence. That's, you basically, you live by the gun, you die by the gun, kind of saying. And the fact that we weren't like that, and that we were able to always explain that, we were in it for the business, not for the title. They respected that. And they respected us, always, just, choosing not to get involved in the violent part. And to us, we're just like blinded, I guess, by, by the world we kind of grew up in. And I never make excuses. Natasha, I want to make it clear. At 17, my brother and I, even though we were young, we knew exactly what we were doing. We knew exactly what we were doing each and every day. Making those decisions to actually, traffic drugs and grow our organization. Like it was something that we dedicated our life to. And yeah, it's one of the, today looking back, it's why I do what I do. Is I feel like I have knowledge and experience to basically help law enforcement, especially with the deadly drug of fentanyl and synthetic drugs that were not around at the time just as much.
And let's talk about that. What was the moment that you turned away from this life? You turned away from what you call the addiction of the money that comes along with this life.
I'm looking at my sons, like 2 years old, and I didn't want that life. And I also didn't want to give up my family. And there's a couple of different issues that different things that happened where I kind of seen what it was going to be like for my family to live without me. And I think that I needed to have something to say, you know what, I could do better. And then one thing for sure is that my wife always said, you're better than this. And I always felt like there was a time where I used to pray and say that I wanted to get out and have a different life, especially in those hard times. I think we all look for a bigger calling when we're suffering in some way, and understanding that there's people around me that are being killed and murdered every day. And I say that there one day in the middle of the night, I feel like I had a spiritual epiphany where I woke up and early morning and with the answer, like it just came to me. And to me at that time, I felt like I was inventing something, because I just didn't see a way out. And I felt like I was inventing, you know, something that no one's ever heard of. And that's how I felt. That's what it was to me. And it was, you know what? I could cooperate. But the one thing I always feel like I have left out was that I knew I had to go to my suffering, meaning my family, everyone around me was going to suffer with this decision. And I know that it's hard for people to understand, because I'm talking today, in hindsight, but I'm going back to what I felt at that time, at that moment, that this was my life. This was my suffering. This is something that I live with. I can't, I only live my life, right? And to me, I felt like, okay, I have to basically suffer for the change. I have to, pay and suffer the consequences. I have to be punished. And I, sometimes compare it to like, uh, when, I hear the stories about someone being, stuck in a cave, right? And they cut off their own arm or cut off their leg to survive. And in this case, I felt like I'm going to have to do whatever I have to do just for the chance, just for the opportunity to have a regular life.
Where did you see this life heading if you continued along the same path?
Great question. I think that we're at the point of no return for me and my brother, where we were going to cross the line that we didn't want to cross. And that meant that at that time that we were going to have to engage in violence, betray some people that I felt were friends at the time. And that weighed on us. I think that made me basically say, you know what? I don't want to be put, I would rather make my own decisions and have someone else make it for me.
Mm.
But I can't take the credit. I feel like, they say you have to kind of stand for something, right? And I believe that, you know what? It in my world that I was living in, it meant a lot to me that I decided to, always, walk away from something that somebody else couldn't. Today I'm the same person. I'll share something with you that no one knows, is that I forgave, the person that kidnapped my brother. I had correspondence with him while he sits in prison.
Wow.
Someone I actually never knew, and I just never carried the hate. And at that time, I just didn't want to, like, for my family, I think I couldn't look at my kids. That I'd rather look at them and say, you know what, I was a coward because I would choose my family, my kids, over anything.
Hmm.
Even
What
over money.
What did you tell your twin brother about getting out of all of this? What did he say?
I mean, my first conversation, when I first actually brought it up to him, it wasn't a pleasant one.
He didn't want to get out.
Yeah. When I mentioned it to him, it's not that he didn't want to get out. It's just that it was something that wasn't an option to him.
Hmm.
So it was we actually had a physical altercation for sure, and he was upset that I even brought it up. And in the business of the drug trade, Natasha, I will tell you something. It's common. You see it today with families, big families, but it's hard to trust someone.
Right. Did it feel like a betrayal of trust to him?
I think that for my brother, it was a betrayal of trust, that I'm sitting there looking at him and he's thinking, are you betraying me?
Yeah.
And it took, I wouldn't say it took maybe 4 or 5 days, and he didn't speak to me. We went about our business just like we had been, and 4 or 5 days later, I remember him calling me and calling me real in the middle of the night, and he basically said, "How will we do it?"
Wow. And how would you do it? What does that look like? Do you just walk into a police station?
You know what? it seemed like that part right there was the most scariest part.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, it was like, we're trying to do the unthinkable. And even when we, just talking about it, I will say I believe in Christ, and I felt like he blinded us from the fear
Mm.
of what we were doing, that we were going to risk our life and our family's life. And I remember just like coming up with different scenarios and being fearful because the Mexican cartels, when it comes to law enforcement, it comes to government, they know everything. It gets leaked. And that's what we're more like fearful of, because, we were on the other side of that information at times. And we basically reached out to an attorney that we felt that we could trust with our life. And my wife was actually going to be the one that was going to go and, fly to Chicago and basically, tell them what we wanted to do. But we gave them a choice before we asked them. We basically said, we have something that we need to talk to you. And we bought a new phone just to be able to speak to them, and said, it's going to be a lot of undertaking, and you don't have to, but if you're interested and you're interested in actually helping, and it could be, a matter between life and death, before you even take this on, because we didn't want to say anything, answer the phone and we'll give you a couple of days and for you to think about it. And
so you went through a lawyer in order to contact law enforcement and to offer up your services as an informant, basically, as someone undercover, helping them bring things down. Is that right?
Yes. At that time, Natasha, like, I didn't know about investigations like that. I was on the opposite side of them, but
Yeah.
to me and my brother, I didn't think that there was going to be an investigation or wiretaps, and I thought it was going to be as easy as, I'm going to take you to the biggest drug lords in the world.
Yeah.
Not one, but three. I had a great relationship with them. By that time, I was basically mentoring their sons to become drug traffickers.
Wow. And who are the three that you're referring to?
At that time, it was El Chapo Guzman, that everyone knows, El Mayo Zambada, who now the world is starting to know, who was the boss for practically 50 years, and Arturo Beltran Leiva, who is now deceased. Who those three jugglers combined probably at one time, probably were responsible for 60 to 70% of all the drugs that came into the United States.
Oh.
Collectively. So we're talking about very powerful men. We thought we were going to say, hey, they're located here, or here is a way to, locate them. And,
Yeah.
or, we're thinking James Bond, Navy SEALs jumping off of airplanes. That
Right.
was our thought, because at that time you would hear over and over again that they didn't know the whereabouts.
And what is the reality?
It's just, they don't know the whereabouts. And I'm like, well, I could go have lunch with them, tomorrow. You want to come? And they looked at me and my brother like we were crazy, like that. It was unbelievable, but we were basically selling them. So it took some convincing, believe it or not. One of the things that we talk about over and over was that they basically gave us a piece of paper and they told my brother, well, here, draw, where do you fit, in the diagram of, the Sinaloa cartel. And, my brother, wrote down Chapo, Mayo, and ABL, which was Arturo Beltran Leiva. And then he did 2 sticks and he put P and J. Like, how else could we explain it? And
did they believe you at first that you had that sort of unprecedented access?
No, absolutely, they didn't.
Yeah.
They didn't believe.
At what point did they believe you? And did you actually go and wear a wire in front of El Chapo, El Mayo, these men?
You know what? There were several meetings at the time. So just to give you some insight, my brother and I, from the day we reached out and the first time we actually talked to the first agent, it was 7 months between that day and us turning ourselves in. And for those people who think that it's just, oh, you just come in a room and cooperate and it's that easy. No, I actually risked my life. each and every day. I had meetings, and our job was to basically gather intelligence, without direction at that time, because we were fugitives of the United States. They couldn't basically negotiate with us. They couldn't, the way they handled us, they couldn't tell us what to do because we were in another country. So we had to kind of act on our own behalf, to just guidance to our attorney and basically saying, hey, we want intel. And there was times where I'd go to meetings and I'd take pictures and do recordings. And
So you start providing intel to them, and who did you actually end up helping to bring down?
so at that time, their biggest target was Chapo Guzman. That was the
Sure.
prize. That's what they wanted. And I had no idea what was it going to become. There's times where I was frustrated because to me, I remember, meeting with DEA agents in Mexico, and I used to be like, I'm gonna go, see him this week. You guys want to come?
Mm-hmm.
Now, it almost sounds like it's a joke, but I really meant, do you want to
Yeah.
like come with me? And they used to be like, absolutely not. We can't do anything like that. And I felt like no one would question me. They wouldn't question me. I had a different relationship. So it took some convincing, and they wanted the target was gonna be Chapo Guzman, and at that time there was no legal recording of Chapo. And what they were looking for was a legal recording of Chapo connecting him to drugs in the United States.
Mm.
And which to me, I thought it was weird that they didn't have no, like recordings on him, or that they didn't have this stuff. Like me being on the other side, I thought that the government was, knew about a lot of the things that were going on. And I remember them asking, like, how long would it take us? I said, give us a week.
Wow. And so you actually wore a wire in front of El Chapo.
Yeah. What I would do, it wasn't a wire, it was just a recording. We'd record to the phone. The dangerous part is that we went to the Radio Shack on our own, and we actually bought a recorder.
You went to a Radio Shack to buy a recorder to
We
record
got
El
smuggled.
Chapo.
Yes, ma'am. And just to give you a backstory about that, the person that actually, first introduced us to recording was Chapo himself. And that first initial meeting that I met him, he asked me to go buy it. He told me, go to Radio Shack and buy a recorder. And he wanted for me to record the person, the associate that had put us in that situation. He said, I want to hear what he has to say. He says, I want you to buy a recorder and record him and bring it back to me.
Wow.
So
what
did
it feel like to be back in front of El Chapo and to know that you were now using that advice but against him?
I try not to think about it.
Mm.
I when I was there, I tried just to kind of like just not think about that, the fear, and I also felt like, but the part where I felt like, it's not that I was like, fearless. I was very fearful, but I was also determined, and I would just try to just, be as comfortable as I could to try to be myself. But also me having this relationship with them, it's not something that even kind of crossed their mind.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm having, these face to face with, the biggest drugs in the world, and out in the mountains with lieutenants and stuff. And there's so much going on that they're more concerned with everything else than they were actually even concerned about me.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you turn over this recording. Does this end up being a crucial piece of evidence that ends up bringing El Chapo down?
You know what? At that time, it ended up being the piece of evidence, right, that they needed. The piece of evidence that was going to basically lead to bigger operations, and to put that pressure on the government. But the fact that we were actually willingly turning ourselves in and cooperating, and basically cooperating against ourselves, right? We're implicating ourselves in one of the biggest, drug operations in the history of the United States. That was a lot at the time.
Right.
And not only that, that recording is the famous one, but there's a bunch of recordings with a bunch of different high-ranking lieutenants, including Vicente Zambada, who by then, to me, was the third in command of the Sinaloa cartel, and he happens to be El Mayo's son. And we were the first. I don't know, maybe this or no, maybe the second indictment. Our indictment out of Chicago was the second indictment on him, and which led to his arrest and his prosecution, and in turn him, flipping on his father and then Chapo, and his testimony was just as crucial as well.
How many cases did you end up contributing to? How many indictments did you end up contributing to?
Wow, a lot of indictments. I think by the time the conspiracy was actually laid out in Chicago, it basically spanned through different districts all over the country, including the District of Brooklyn, Manhattan, California, Texas. It was
Would you
massive.
say more than a dozen?
Yes, more than a dozen. In terms of indictments in different cases, it was far more than a dozen, and some of these cases are still going on today, as you know, with Chapo's sons in Chicago and Miles Zambada being in New York now.
Jay, how are you still alive with doing this work and having your name out there?
I will say, you know what? I think it's by the grace of God. I think that I'm supposed to be here. I'm supposed to be, sharing the story with you. I'm supposed to be, sharing my knowledge and experience with law enforcement. I think that, it was a path that was laid out for me by something bigger than me. And I will tell you, it's, some people don't know the whole story, and for me, it's also, I guess, an example. Forget the drug trade. Just to think about where I'm at, if we could just apply that to life and just think about the possibilities. I went from being in the mountaintops of Sinaloa, working with some of the biggest drug lords in the world, to actually, walk in the House of Congress, and being in a room full of law enforcement, right? It's like, that's still sometimes when I'm, at different conferences, I just, I'm like, wow, like, this is actually, I still can't believe that part. I think the good part, the positive part, I still can't believe.
It's inspiring. And Jay, let me ask you, I mean, you cooperate with law enforcement, you turn yourself in, you provide crucial evidence. You still ended up serving time. Is that right?
Yes. To put this in perspective, I turned myself in November 30th of 2008. I didn't get to see, the judge till January 27th of 2015. It took me 6 years to basically be rewarded. And then I worked 7 months, my brother and I, we worked 7 months undercover, with the threat of being killed. And I will tell you, Natasha, there's people that were cooperating around the same time we were cooperating that didn't make it.
Yeah. I believe that.
And that, especially being there while we're cooperating, and basically we're getting information, the cooperators that are being discovered, because of leaked information from the Mexican government that we're not going to make it out alive. To us, it was like, it was those times that were like, what were we doing? And I remember, the first time being, the first night being in a jail cell and feeling free.
Wow. Because you felt protected there.
Yeah, just feeling like that protection, feeling that, the freedom from living with that weight on me for so long.
Wow. How long did you end up serving, and on what charges?
We pleaded out to a drug conspiracy charge that eventually, our charges carried multiple life sentences. So.
Oh, wow.
The government requested a 10-year sentence for us. And the judge ended up giving us
So that was the deal. In exchange for the extraordinary information, the key pieces of evidence, multiple life sentences reduced down to 10.
No, they recommended 10 years. And the way it works, just so you understand, no promises in terms of years were ever given to us. It was basically, it's up to the judge, that's not our power, but we were able to negotiate later a 10 to 16 year range, and the judge gave us a 14-year sentence. I served 12. I served exactly 12 years in a federal prison. You
served 12 years in federal prison at the end of the day.
Yes. I earned 2 years of good time, and I served. Me and my brother both served a 12-year sentence. We were released on the same exact day.
Were you able to serve together?
Um, for 9 months we were together. And there's a policy that, in the federal prison system, the identical twins cannot be housed together. For security concern.
Yeah.
So,
wow, that must have been hard to be separated from your wife, from your children for that period of time.
you know what? I think that in a way, I would say that was good. I wanted to make sure that my kids knew one day, that my wife knew one day, that I felt like I was doing something for them, because I didn't want to be like, okay, you know what is this? And I think that I didn't want my kids to be raised in the same environment as I did. And thank God, because they have a totally different upbringing. But in a way, what I wanted ended up happening. I raised my kids through prison visits. I got to see my kids grow up, from a prison cell. And I will say this, and just I'm well aware. I'm very self-aware of what people could think or say, but I earned that. I earned that punishment. Absolutely. I also earned the reward I got, for my cooperation.
Yeah. After making this incredible choice, you do such important work, which is training law enforcement, and you still consult and still meet with representatives, congresspeople as well, to give your expertise. Tell me a little more about this. In your opinion, what will it take to take down the cartels?
Once I was in prison, I kept thinking how, what was going to be of my life, and I wanted to make sure that I could give back. And, let's face it, like, I grew up as a drug trafficker. And I would see these clips, and I see what was happening in the world, and I felt like I could use my, my knowledge for good now. I remember being a big fan of, the movie Catch Me If You Can, and Frank Abagnale, right, changed his life and went out to do, amazing work, for the FBI. And I felt like I could make a difference, but it's not easy, even, with what I do. I work with law enforcement. I basically give seminars to federal, state, local law enforcement officers. I sat down with Congress, lawmakers, different, universities, and I speak with at-risk youth, and I advocate for, drug prevention.
Yeah.
And it's,
what are you teaching them? What are you seeking to share with law enforcement?
well, there's so many different aspects, and one for sure is basically cultivating informants and handling informants, because I've been through there. I actually walked through those. I had to live through those experiences, and also just how Mexican drug cartels and major drug trafficking organizations operate, the ins and the outs, but more importantly, I feel like my reason for this, my foundation for this, is that I think that more needs to be done, and then we could have a really significant impact on Mexican drug cartels if we're change and switch up our strategy a little bit, by not just focusing on the drugs coming in to the country, but focusing the billions of dollars that's actually being exported our country each and every day into Mexico. And money is what fuels the business. I'm an advocate for continuing going after the drugs, because people are going to listen to me like, oh, he's a drug trafficker, doesn't want to support the drug trade. No, I'm saying add to it, but focus more on what fuels the drug trade. What the government for the last 50 years, what you heard is the war on drugs. It's not a war. It's a business. If you look at it as a war, then you're going to continue to fail. The mindset of law enforcement all over the country, probably all over the world, is that they get rewarded for discovering drugs. As a drug trafficker, those losses are part of the business. And if you look around the country, we're not focusing, everyone focusing on in the cars and semis and, importation of drugs coming, going north or east, but no one focuses on what's coming south, and that means billions of dollars, along with military grade weapons that go.
How is all of that money, and how are those weapons making it from the United States south past the border?
Just imagine tons of bulk U.S. currency moving south into Mexico by different means. It could be by semi-tractor trailer, uh, you know, uh, personal, passenger vehicles, by different means. But it all gets, basically packaged, counted, and then it's moved throughout the United States into Mexico.
Wow. Okay, because I imagine that this was an electronic thing, that these were wire transfers of money. But you're saying that there are literally, whether it's in smaller vehicles or semi-tractor trailers, they're filled with American currency that are headed from the United States back down to Mexico as part of the cyclical drug trade.
You know what? The drug trade has one dominant currency. That's the American dollar. I know that it's common. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, especially right now with social media and the internet where cryptocurrency could be used, but
Yeah.
but that exists more in the movies.
What happens if we are able to successfully intercept all these giant shipments of U.S. dollars that are heading from this country down past these border checkpoints?
Yeah, well, it's from my knowledge, my experience, and everything that I know is that in the business, the way it funnels down is that everybody takes a cut, but that money fuels reinvestment in more drugs. It fuels corruption. It fuels, that money is going to buy, military style weapons. That money's going to buy more sicarios.
Yeah.
These sicarios that are creating the violence in Mexico, they get paid. They do it for the money as well, and you need money basically to make more money. And I will tell you, in the time I was trafficking drugs, we took losses of seizures for drugs, but we were basically 0% money seizures.
Wow.
Going into Mexico. And just to give you kind of an understanding, at one time, later the government, once they added up, through our ledgers, like the money that we were actually exporting back into Mexico, unbeknownst to us, we were not keeping track, like that. It was over $2 billion worth of drugs. Of over $2 billion of bulk U.S. currency that we exported back into Mexico. And that was just our organization. That wasn't every organization, because there's many of them. We weren't the only ones. And just to put things in perspective, it's like that is what these wars in Mexico are about. It's money. It's money, it's power, and money buys you power.
Yeah.
And I really think that if we were to change our focus and just maybe make Americans a little bit uncomfortable, and maybe basically put a little bit more effort into going after the money. And one thing I want to point out is that the biggest drug distributors in the United States is going to be your FedEx, your UPS.
Wow.
United States Postal Service. If you combine all these partial companies that do services, there's more drugs being shipped to their companies, to their packaging systems than you can imagine. That's how drugs get to universities, to small rural towns, to states that don't have presence of cartels. Chicago, Atlanta, New York, LA, they're hubs. But, right now, with the fentanyl crisis, if you look at the demographics at where it's being sold, we're looking at rural areas, and there's nothing being done on that end either. These companies are not investing on combating drug trafficking in their systems. They, as a matter of fact, for many times, they make it even difficult for law enforcement to investigate these packages that, are moving, probably deadly, doses of fentanyl, in their companies.
One more question for you, Jay. Do you fear for your life today?
I do. I do feel for it. It's also like something I learned to live with. Many people are gonna say you come on and do this interview and how could you say you're fearful? I think that I'm more determined to make a difference, and that's the only reason why I actually do this. I do this because I do believe I can make a difference. I do believe that I could bring some changes, and I think that it's my duty to do it. I have to, I do this for my redemption as well. And I want to make sure that, all the stuff I went through, all the stuff my family went through, that it means something, that it was worth for something. And if I could actually highlight, and hopefully, with your help, we're highlighting some major issues that could, that we could bring to light and make some change, maybe save some more lives.
Jay Flores, it's been an illuminating conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.